things we would ask, be sure you sign in, even though we may have your information already. We like to keep track of how many people we actually have at these programs, and then also it's a chance to update any contact information, because people's emails and chat addresses and all that tend to change from time to time, and that way we can keep track of you. We may want you back. So anyhow, we certainly, we've got 3 very interesting papers presented this morning, and we're looking forward to doing that. I want to first of all actually recognize the Celebrate Cowley County History Committee that's been working actually since last year to put together today's program. We have, of course, our leader, Cindy Kurtz, Jerry Wallace, who couldn't be with us due to family health issues today, Jane Sandville, who's always with us here, Gloria Albrecht, way back yonder over there, Boss Fair, wherever we lost someplace here, and Gary Lerner, who is our tech guy back there at the back, as well as the presenter this morning. Recognize the president of the Cowley County Historical Society, Madison Metzinger, but I don't believe she's here this morning either. Again, I've done this before, but I need to kind of distinguish a little bit some differences here. And something that I didn't understand for a lot of years myself, and that's to distinguish between the Cowley County Historical Society Museum and the Celebrate Cowley County History entity. The museum, I mean, they're financially and organizationally, they're entirely separate entities, although we have people involved in both there. The museum pays for the printing and publishing of the booklets, in which we have the papers here, and then they sell the booklets as their primary fundraiser for the year, other than memberships. And they certainly need the money. The museum, as you're well aware, is a neat building, but it's an old building, and it's a large building. And you can imagine some of the issues that go with that. Utilities, insurance, just maintenance on a yearly basis. It takes a lot of money just to keep that building open and operating. And that's, so to help with that, they sell these booklets as a fundraiser. In addition to that this morning, they also, sitting back here at the tables, back there with Gloria and Brittany and Jody, have other items from the museum that are available here to purchase if you're interested in any of those things. But especially what a deal we have for you today, a one-time special deal on the past booklets. Everything from last year on back that Gloria's holding up normally are $15. Special just for you today, $12 each on any of those. So if you're missing any of the old ones and want to catch up on them, today is a good time to do that, because there is a cut rate on that. Then the Celebrate Cowley County History entity, which puts on the program today, and it's separate, it's financially separate and distinct from the museum. Now, we do have not a lot of expense involved in this, but there's several $100s worth of expense going in just to put on today's program, which the Celebrate Cowley County History entity has to pay for. That's why you will see these silver baskets on your table with a request for donations there to help us pay for the things that we have to do just to put on today's program. We obviously have to pay Baden for the use of their facility, because they have expenses too. The coffee, drinks, and cookies, which we will have at the break, all cost some too. So we certainly appreciate any donations that you might give us to help just to pay for the program today. One other thing available today, the Arts and Humanities Council has a table way back there where Stephanie's sitting, and they have some items, especially some of the 150th stuff from Winfield, that they have some items that are available for sale sale too. You might take a look at their stuff while you're here today too. That's the main thing I want to say. Our plan for today is we've got, as I say, 3 papers. We'll have 2 of them presented, take a break for coffee, cookies, whatever, and then we'll have the 3rd one to finish up. Our first programmer's paper this morning is one that involving an area that is for which Cowley County is pretty famous. And at one time, it was a major economic entity in western Cowley County and even eastern Sumner County. But I'm always surprised, to some extent, when on Facebook, when you see something pop up about Rainbow Bend. And then how many times, as long as it's been around, people will ask, what's that? Where was that? Where is that? What's that? Well, today, we're fortunate to be able to find out, because we're also very fortunate that our presenter, while she's far too young to have been around when it was in its heyday. Is that helping any, Joann? Her family has lived in that area out there for decades, and as such, she has grown up with people who, some of whom are no longer with us, but was able to get stories from them. She still knows people that have lengthy histories back there. And so with that, let's welcome Joann Parsons to tell us about the Rainbow Bend.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Kenny Glasgow grew up in the Rainbow Bend area on a farm in the heart of the Rainbow Bend community. He lived there his whole life, with the exception of his time in the Navy. I interviewed Kenny a few years before his death in 2021. I also interviewed Marlene Greer Harger, who grew up in Rainbow Bend. Additionally, I interviewed Phyllis Nelson Hearn, who did not live in Rainbow Bend, but that rode the Rainbow Bend bus to the high school. By strange coincidence, when I called to interview Phyllis, her friend Lois Heskett was there at the time, and she had also ridden the Rainbow Bend bus. And Lois's mother had operated the Rainbow Bend grocery store for a short time. It is from these interviews that I present this paper today. Before I start, I'll share what I heard Kenny say so many times as he shared stories. This was obviously Kenny's quote, but it applies to me today as well. What I'm going to tell you, I believe is the absolute truth. But it might be a lie. Kenny was very funny. He was a wonderful, wonderful storyteller. He always had fun little anecdotes and bits and pieces that would just made it so delightful to listen to him. Largely due to the oil boom in the area, Rainbow Bend, Kansas became a thriving little community, complete with an oil refinery, more than 24 homes for the oil field refinery workers and their families, a grade school, a grocery store, a nice baseball field, and a basketball court, sometimes used as a dance hall. And Rainbow Bend is on the west side of the Arkansas River in Cowley County and Beaver Township. We'll show you a map in a little bit to narrow that down a little bit more. The refinery, many of the wells from this boom, the camp, the courthouse, and the ball diamonds were all within the same square mile. The last Rainbow Bend school was on the northeast corner at the edge of that square mile. The grocery store was in that area. We'll show you. This is, what you see on the screen now is a little memorial marker that was put up, I believe, in the 1990s. And that tells you where the grocery store was, and that general area is Rainbow Bend. It was, if you happen to know where Slate Valley Baptist Church is, it's a few miles south of Oxford. Rainbow Bend was a couple miles east of that, and many of the Rainbow Bend residents in the area attended that church. The name Rainbow Bend originated from Dora Johnson. Now, many people think it was called Rainbow Bend because of the oil boom, the gold at the end of the rainbow. But Kenny said that Dora Johnson's family, the Johnson family, had settled in that area in 1871, which was the same year the Glasgow family settled there. And at that time, there was a bend in the nearby Arkansas River that was almost a hairpin-shaped curve. Mrs. Johnson thought it looked like a rainbow, hence the name. The bend shape was altered in the flood of 1922. As rivers sometimes do, the river changed its path, significantly altering the bend that originally inspired the name. The 1923 discovery well was drilled on Dora Johnson's property in the northeast corner of her quarter section. The next well, this confused me, but I'm not an oil field person. The next well, called number 1, was on John Glasgow's land, an offset west of the discovery well. And there is, I believe there is an error in my paper. It was brought to my attention that the number 2 well was the big gusher, but we have, in my paper it says it's on John Glasgow's land, but we think it probably was on the Johnson land. This was the beginning of a true boom. Many, many more wells, I've read as much as 125 were drilled on these farms and others nearby. During this time period, the Rainbow Bend oil field was rumored to be the largest producing field in the state of Kansas at that time, although that I have not verified that. The number 2 well was a gusher when it came in. Supposedly the heaviest flowing well in Kansas at that time. Large crews were needed to drill and maintain the many wells. A refinery was built on site. This was a common practice at that time to not ship the crude, but rather the refined product. The original driller was Wade. I have in my book Wade Phillips, but I've seen some things that say Waite Phillips, W-A-I-T-E, of Barnsdall Oil. And Wade later became part of Phillips Oil out of Oklahoma. Now, as you see this map here, this is kind of interesting because Gary was nice enough to colorize this map, and I think I need to get where I can read it more easily. What you see that's in black was produced, and this was from a 1929 map of the Rainbow Bend oil field with 125 producing wells. Where it's in black, those wells were producing 100 to 500 barrels a day. In red, the wells were producing 500 to 1,000 barrels a day. What's in green, 1,000 to 3,000 barrels a day. And what's in blue, the oval here that's pretty close to the center at the bottom, 3,000 plus barrels a day. So I wasn't watching, Gary. Did you show the slide of the Cowley County map?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. The houses in Camp Row, or the camp, were on a single street, and they were all on one side of the street. The production workers' homes were at the north end of the street. The refinery employees' homes were separate to the south. An alley ran behind the homes. The combined length of the production and refinery employees' homes was about a half-mile area. The homes were identical in design, described as shotgun homes, because a shot through the front door would go straight through the house and out the back door. These homes and neighbors' homes nearby had natural gas, probably at no cost to the families, if they had a well on their land. So that was natural gas went to those homes in the camp and a few other areas. He's shown you a panoramic photo here. It's actually, over on the table we have one of the photos. It was, which in the frame over there is close to 4 foot wide. And so it doesn't quite, it's a little harder to envision because just, if you made it wide enough to fit in the book, it just took away from it a little bit. So the next photo is a close-up of the panoramic. So you can see the houses. You can tell that they were identical in design. Gary and I think that that larger structure behind the row of houses there is probably the refinery. Truman, where are you at, Truman? Was that the refinery? Truman.
We're right across there, and sometimes the windows rattle on account of the vibration.
Awesome. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. This is a newspaper article from 1951, the Neighbor Achievement edition of the Courier. Let's go to the next slide. So you can see here, some of you in the back, I'm just going to read the first paragraph here. So this was 1951, and they were talking about Rainbow Bend. 15 to 18 million barrels of oil have been pumped from the famous Rainbow Bend field in central western Cowley County, one of the most famous fields in southern Kansas oil history. At peak production, 24,000 barrels a day were pumped, and approximately 300 men employed there. So they had a lot of neighbors and such that were, some of them I think pretty much gave up farming to work in the oil field, but some of them continued to do both. I think we have another slide. This area, and a copy of this newspaper article is over there on the table. It has a list of the employees that were there in 1951, tell about the different supervisors, managers of different departments, etc. Okay, nicknamed the courthouse, at least by the Glasgow family, there was a basketball court in a tin building. And also in that big panoramic picture over on the table, Glenda Schmidt's mom, Shirley Holman Schmidt, had put a label as to where the basketball court was. And he said that sometimes they had dances there, but primarily it was a basketball court. In this area, there was also the office, maintenance shop for trucks, and a large pipe yard. At some point in later years, a fairly small shed was built in this area for domino and card games, and all of these things were built by the oil company. In 1926, the red brick Rainbow building was built. This school served as, was for the camp children and other children in school district 61. So a lot of the neighborhood farm areas, a mile or two or more away, I don't know how far the students came from, but they were on the west side of the river. You never knew when the river was going to be out or the bridge would be washed out. So these kids were from the west side of the river. There were 2 classrooms, one for grades 1 through 4 and the other for grades 5 through 8. The basement had a stage and a basketball court with goals at each end. Kenny reported that many a light bulb had to be replaced, victims of flying balls since the ceiling wasn't terribly high. Kenny remembers classroom teacher Coma Jones, wife of Dewart Jones, for any of you old-timers, and the mother of Byron Jones, who was a high school science teacher. Coma Jones taught at Rainbow Bend, and he said she was deeply passionate about both vocal and instrumental music, which deeply influenced Kenny's lifelong involvement as a sound man and an instrumentalist, in addition to his day job in the aircraft industry. Lucille Beach Battendorf also taught at the school. And Kenny wasn't sure exactly, but he thought the school building was either built by the Johnson family or the oil company. Kenny remembers his older brother John, who was 11 years older, had a teacher named Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks was also a farmer. One time, probably in the 1930s, Mr. Brooks drove his wheat truck to school, loaded up all of the kids in the back of his wheat truck, and took them to the salt mines in Hutchinson. I'm just imagining all those kids in the back of the wheat truck for a couple hours. I bet that was a good time. Henry Greer was a custodian at the school in Rainbow Bend's later years. His daughter Marlene helped with these duties so they could get home faster. They lived next door to the north of the school. She reported that the Greer family had no hot water, so she and her sister showered at the school. The shower was in the landing area between the basement and the ground floor in a small locker room of sorts. She said it wasn't a fancy shower, just a drain hole in the concrete. She thinks most kids didn't even know about that shower. Mrs. Hope Glasgow, Kenny's mother, was the school cook, and she said the meals were absolutely wonderful. She said not only was Hope the cook, but she was a true friend and a role model that sincerely enriched her life. Marlene's mother had died when she was little. Hope often sent lunch leftovers home for Mr. Greer, Marlene, and her older sister, Mary Ruth. However, at some point, the school board found out about this practice of sending the lunches home, and that was the end of that. So this is the brick school that was right on the corner across from the grocery store. And I wasn't watching, Gary. Did you already show them the picture of the first building? Okay, that was the first building. And I'm looking at that, and it's like they had one teacher. There's like 30-some kids there. That's a bunch of kids. Well, I don't know what year that photo was taken. Speaking of this school building is actually in the big panoramic photo. So we can assume that the big panoramic picture was taken before 1926, or maybe that year, and then Kenny indicated that was torn down quite soon. And it happened that before the brick school was built, right across the road from that location, they had a beer joint. But as soon as the red brick school opened up, they got rid of the beer joint. Probably a good thing, wouldn't want the kids stopping in there. Across the alley behind the row of houses, about 250 yards east of the school, was a nice baseball diamond, complete with a backstop and dugouts. Truman, did you play baseball there, softball? Yeah. He said the Rainbow Bend kids knew not to slide into third base because there was a patch of goat-head grass there, which meant thousands of nasty stickers, each sticker in a tiny ball shape with multiple protruding points. Opposing teams as well soon learned not to slide into third base. Marlene's dad, Henry, was often the umpire in the late 40s and 50s. Marlene reports that he was known for being a stickler for the rules. Kenny remembers playing teams from District 48, which later became known as South Vernon, and Martha Washington schools. In the early days, there had been a very basic ball diamond in the Workman pasture, which was east of the production homes. Is there anyone here besides Becky and Truman that went to Rainbow Bend School? Please raise your hand. Well, I was talking with Becky last week, and the date that Kenny's not here, so I'll blame this on myself. I had the school closing in 1961, but Becky said that she started first grade in 1954 and went to Rainbow Bend through 5th grade, which would have put, that would have put the spring year of her 5th grade in 59. And she said the school closed that year. Around that time, a lot of schools were closing for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it was just because you were down to 5 or 6 kids. And then, but the state funding was also changing in their requirements, and so many schools in Cowley County and all over Kansas closed their doors in that time period. During the peak oil boom years, there was a school bus that took the District 61 kids to Winfield High School, which was 12 miles away. Kenny said the first bus was a delivery truck with long benches inside it, and that was their bus. In time, a more conventional school bus was used. If the bus was not filled with District 61 kids, other students were picked up at farms on the east side of the river en route to Winfield. Reportedly, for many years, no buses other than the Rainbow Bend bus delivered students to Winfield High School. In the late 30s and early 40s, two of my aunts rode that bus, because our family farm's just on the east side of the river bridge, about half a mile. And but my dad, who graduated in 1935, there wasn't room for him on the bus. John Glasgow, and John's son David is here. This is young John, since the original homesteader is referred to by the family as Old John. Kenny rode the bus, and Mary Ellen Woods is here today. Her brothers Daryl and Lyle and her sister Phyllis Nelson Hearn also rode the bus. And then a neighbor of the Nelsons too. So some people walked a mile or a mile and a half or so just to catch the bus. My time is getting close to the end, so I'm trying to abbreviate here. From the corner east of my house, which would be a little over half mile east of the river bridge, the bus went north 1 mile and picked up someone there. And he said it picked up Peggy Savage at the Nellie Kent corner. It proceeded in the north, and it also picked up your mom too, right, Nancy?
Yes, that's what I've heard.
So Pat Taylor Rosecrans was picked up 2 miles north of where I grew up. And then it went north across 160 up to the Kellogg corner and picked up someone, and then it went back to Highway 160, picked up perhaps some of the Ramsey kids, and then proceeded on into Winfield. Thought it was kind of interesting. Mr. Greer drove the bus to school in the 40s and 50s after he delivered the kids. He parked his bus at the ice plant on the west side of Winfield, and he worked at Gott Manufacturing, which at that time was also on the west side of Winfield. Speaking of the bus and such, I've got probably an incomplete list of Shirley Holman Schmidt had passed out questionnaires at the Rainbow reunions, and people wrote down the names of teachers, including art and music teachers that they remembered, and Bible study. And I saw my great aunt's name there, and I'm like, what? She wasn't a teacher. But I read in Glenda's mother, Shirley Schmidt, also had notes from the parent-teacher organization, and at one point they approved Bible studies. So I'm guessing that maybe my great aunt went over and helped with Bible study. The Rainbow Bend grocery store is kind of interesting. Kenny said it was called Four Corners because it was the only intersection on the west side of the Arkansas River in Beaver Township that actually had four corners. This building was about 16 feet wide, 30 to 40 feet long. It had 2 rooms. It had a lean-to on one side with an air compressors for locals to use at no charge. There was a place to patch tires for your vehicle or bicycle. The old tire patches and pop bottle lids were just thrown on the ground and served like gravel in the driveway. During cool weather in the fall and spring, this lean-to also served as a place to cool off the pop, like a natural refrigerator. The store had a gas pump. They, of course, sold groceries and cans of motor oil. And if you had need for larger amounts of oil, you could pump it out of a barrel. The second room served as a dining room and bedroom for the owner if they needed it. Most owners had the store open 7 days a week, maybe from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The store had an outhouse out back. Mr. Hall, possibly had the store first. Ted Gross ran the grocery store at some point, and he later sold it to Velma Heskett. Eventually, Ted started Gross's IGA in Arkansas City. Ralph Ferris owned the store, Henry Thomas and the Trent family, and John Glasgow, whose son David is here. David, you want to raise your hand, please? His parents, I believe, were the last ones to have the grocery store, and Kenny did not know what date the grocery store closed, but David believes it was in the 50s. There's kind of a fun story about domino games, but I'm trying to abbreviate my story here, but that's in the book today. Kenny believes that in 1951 or 52, the gas at the oil field possibly ran out. At any rate, residents of the area started buying their own butane for heating their homes. At some point, Barnesdall Oil sold to Sunray, and gradually the wells were fewer and the production was not what it had been in its heyday. The refinery was closed, date unknown, but probably in the early 1950s. The last refinery superintendent was Tom Minahan. Kenny said that just before the Minahan family moved on, he spent about a week at their house, just hanging out, saying goodbye to their son Tommy. Fewer and fewer people resided in the camp. Some homes were moved to other locations. The houses were offered to the families at no cost, but they had to pay to have them moved. Now, it's come to my attention that some families were not offered the house for free, but we believe that the very last few were offered. And one such house is at 414 McCabe near Southwestern College. Other houses were moved to Oxford. Lefty's real name was Ray, so Lefty and Flora Sanders were the last residents of the camp. In the 1960s, the home they had lived in for decades was moved to Arkansas City, to a location on the south side of Madison on 15th Street. Today, few clues remain that would give you any hint that Rainbow Bend Oil Field and Camp once existed. No buildings remain. The stone marker that simply says Rainbow Bend was erected in the 1990s where the grocery store once was. Other than that, only tales of its glory days remain. There are still a few oil wells in that area, which, when you think about it, that some of them have been pumping oil out of that area for over 100 years now. It's a mere shadow of what once was a thriving little boomtown. It's apparent that this community, like others of its time, was a big family of sorts. Everyone helped everyone else. They worked, played, prayed, and learned together. And neighbors helped each other's children, helped raise each other's children. Do we have another slide here? Okay. This is a photo of old John Glasgow and his second wife, Susan. John settled there in 1871. Quite an interesting fellow. He was born in Scotland, and there are different variety of stories about how he ended up in America. But one such story is that he was a stowaway on a ship as an adolescent and ended up sailing the seas for a few years. But when the Civil War started, he joined the Union and ended up in Rainbow Bend in 1871. And then we have another picture. And this is a picture of Kenny Glasgow. If you went to Walnut Valley Festival or Art in the Park in Winfield or Ark City and many other venues, he was a bass player, and his bass was quite unique because it was made of metal and it was silver. And he played for a number of different bands. He was a sound man. He got acquainted with some people who made it big. I think I'm right that at one point he was sound man when Reba McEntire was in the area, probably in the 80s. So then later he and Joe would, after he retired, they would go on a cruise, and he would be part of a band that would play for a month and did a lot of really interesting things. He had worked in the oil field. He worked very briefly for Cessna, and he worked a little less than 40 years at GE. So, Rainbow Bend.
Thank you, Joann. Our next presenter, if you want to start up this way, is an old friend, more ways than one, since Gary and I went to junior high and high school together. Of course, he's a lot older than I am. But the other thing is, he's a car nerd, and as such, got interested in the next topic, which is automobile racing in Cowley County. And he's told me that if he realized really how much history there is in Cowley County, he would have narrowed this topic a lot more than he did. Because surprisingly, there is a lot of automobile racing that has gone on over the years here in Cowley County. And with that, making way up here is Gary Lerner.
Okay, this is going to be an overview of auto racing in Cowley County. As Bill said, if I had it to do again, I think I would narrow the focus of this, but we've just got a lot of ground to cover here in the allotted time. Therefore, we will not be covering motorcycles, micro midgets, go-karts, figure-8 races, or demo derbies. We're going to talk about wheel-to-wheel racing only with full-size autos. A major portion of what you're going to see today is the result of a lot of work by a former Winfield resident by the name of Bob Lawrence. Back in the 90s, he started putting together web pages that number in the hundreds, literally. covering not only Cowley County, but other Kansas oval track racing, as well as motorcycle racing to some extent. So, in the order of their appearance, God, I hope this is going to work. Go ahead. They're good. In order of their appearance, we're going to start with Arkansas City in 1905. It was a 1/2 mile dirt oval that was obviously originally intended to be used as a horse racing track. Like a lot of cities, our city had such a place, and it was located in what they called Athletic Park. Athletic Park was located out by the AC Mill, which became Dixie Portland and now ADM. Between the railroad yard and that mill complex was where Athletic Park was located, including the the 1/2 mile dirt oval. There was talk of moving that facility even before 1900, but we don't know if, when, or where for sure that facility might have been moved. I have done some study, and if it was moved as was suggested at one point, just east of the Arkansas River, this is where it probably would have ended up, because that big purple splotch there is all City of Arkansas City property. And as you can see, I've scaled a 1/2 mile oval in there. There would have been plenty of room for the 1/2 mile oval, as well as the football field and baseball and all that. And at one time, our athletic park even had a shooting range. So it was quite a facility. Anyway, regardless of where it was located, we know that Athletic Park was to be the site of a large Labor Day celebration in 1905, and it would include what we believe to be the first automobile race held in this county. Next slide. This is a list from the Traveler that shows all the activities that were going to take place that day. There's a little bit of everything going on, including a boys' potato race, a 1/2 mile pace, another 1/2 mile pace, boys' sack race, 2 mile automobile race. It was quite a celebration. But the topper apparently was Professor Whipple's balloon ascension, which topped off the day. They claimed to have seats for, what does that say? 1,500. Yeah, quite a facility in any case. The other race, actually, though, was an exhibition. Next slide. That involved 2 Cadillac automobiles that were owned by the Cadillac Car Company, and they were simply showing them off. They were Model D Cadillacs, advertised to have 30 horsepower and a top speed of 50 miles an hour, and they were $2,800 cars, which is about $100K today, so they were not cheap. It was Cadillac's first model that was really intended for the luxury market. The cars were stripped down, though, these two, and apparently had some engine modifications, because the press releases claimed that they were good for 70 miles an hour top speed and had 40 horsepower instead of 30. This is a Buick, but this is a typical stripped down factory racer. Obviously, all the bodywork disappeared, the fenders, the steering column was leaned back so you could set the driver down lower on the chassis. Pretty much stock running gear as far as the axles and gearbox and all that was concerned. So, not surprisingly anyway, the Cadillacs won all 3 races that day, and I'm sure they advertised that with a wink, but the 5-mile feature race, the winning speed was about 45 miles an hour. The next day, the Traveler, the reporter covering this event, was a little less than enthusiastic about what he saw as far as the auto race was concerned. I suppose maybe Professor Whipple's balloon ascension might have biased him, might have. Next slide. That, by the way, so far as I can tell, and Mr. Lawrence, was the one and only race ever run in Ark City at that facility, wherever it was located. Because the next races that are run in Ark City are like 20 years later at a different site. So if we come up the road about 12 miles of Winfield Fairgrounds, there was another 1.5 mile dirt track intended for horses, and it was very similar to the one in Ark City. Next slide. The first organized race here appears to have been in 1909, and we think this picture might be from that particular event. The records show that that day, Dr. Kimball from Ark City won the feature race at a Hudson 20, and that 20 represents the horsepower for the stock automobile. And the next day, on October 16th, Lloyd Haight from Winfield was the winner in a Buick surprise prize. Average speeds for the weekend appear to have been just about 40 miles an hour. Next slide. Races at Winfield were held regularly from 1909 through about 1915 with similar stripped-down stock cars. During this era, it was mostly modified production, not pure race cars. That picture is 4 Buicks that were lined up in front of the local Buick dealership. I believe it was Carlton at the time, the 19-teens. 3 of them are actually contestants in the next day's race, but one of them is not. At number 13, I believe it is, on the left end, was actually a stock Buick that had been stripped down just to promote the race and the brand. Buick was a sales leader at that time, just behind Ford after the introduction of the T-Model. So, there were no races at the fairgrounds from 16 to 1926, but in 1927 they started up again, 1 to 2 races per year, running through 1935. During this period, the race cars running were more specialized and actually purpose-built machines, next slide, with highly modified engines typically. As you can see, this was a single seat, custom bodywork sort of setup, no pretense to being stock. It was built as a race car. I'm sure there might have been some off-the-shelf components under there somewhere, but it was not anything that resembled something you would drive on the street. Then again, in 1935 through 1949, of course, the World War II had something to do with this, but there were no races at the 1/2 mile in Winfield. Then beginning in 1950, jalopy-style races were organized at the fairgrounds track. Next slide. These were typically 32 to 39-year model cars that were stripped and strengthened, but with stock or at least allegedly stock engines and drivetrains. Ford V8s and Hudsons with the big inline 6 tended to dominate these type of races, but there would also be an occasional heat race, one with a Chevy or a Plymouth with the smaller 6-cylinder engines. The jalopy stock car class of racing ran regularly at Winfield, like I say, 2-3 races per year, through about 1958. Next slide. The final auto racing period for the fairgrounds track began in 1967, running through 1971. There were a total of 9 races run during that period, all being tested with later model type stock cars, 1949 through 1960 model years eligible. Next slide. The last auto race held at the fairgrounds was on 25 July 1971 with Gary Moore from Wichita winning the race in a 1960 Plymouth. I believe there were some motorcycle races held after that, but that definitely appears to have been the last full-size automobile race held at the Winfield Fairgrounds. Next slide. Here's an example of some of Mr. Lawrence's work. This shows essentially every race, and some of the data is missing, but it lists every race of full-size automobiles run at the Winfield Fairgrounds over a period of about 50 years. Like I say, I personally owe him a debt of gratitude, because otherwise this would have been too much work. It just couldn't have happened. Next slide. With the interest in automobile racing that went on in the 20s, there was a group in our city that decided they should take advantage of this because they saw what was happening at the Winfield Fairgrounds. And they decided to begin looking for a place to build a dedicated track. Next slide. This trackwork clipping says, if you're interested in the auto racing problem of our Kansas City, you're urged to be president of CCCH for discussion. And I think this means they thought that the fact that they didn't have a racetrack was a problem. I'm not sure how to interpret that. But anyway, they talked about it for about a year and a half, but it wasn't until late 28 when they started building what was proposed to be, or purported to be, an amusement park west of our city. It was to include a 1.5 mile bank, purpose-built automobile racing track, but it would also have rides, amusements, and other park features. Next slide. The track was completed June 29 and had bank turns, seating capacity of 3,500, and advertised as second to none in the Midwest. And on July 4th, 1929, the first races were held. And that's a little bit of an eye chart, I agree, but inside that red circle is the remnants of that 1.5 mile oval. This is a 1938, if I remember correctly, aerial photo of the area. So it's just west of the Arkansas River and just north of West Madison Avenue, and between the two railroad Ys that occur at the west end of that bridge. Next slide. The first race, as I say, was in June of 29, and Cowley won that race. And we believe this is the car he was driving that day. He was a local Arkansas City oil man. There was $1,000 purse total offered that day, and Cowley took home $350 of it. Next slide. One more race was held that year, and there were a total of 3 races held in 1930, the last one being November 10th on Veterans Day. But those later races, particularly those in 1930, were very poorly attended because the stock market had crashed and there was a depression moving in, so to speak. So it was taking its toll on both the owners and the spectators' pocketbooks. Note the empty, literally empty grandstands there in that shot. And this is the start of the feature races in 1930. Next slide. So by January of 1934, we see this ad in the Daily Traveler saying, hey, you want to buy a racetrack? It's for sale. Got 38 acres that goes with it. But that languished for a while, and it didn't really sell until a few years later, I believe in 37. A lady from Oklahoma bought the 38 acres and plowed it all up and turned it back into farmland. Next slide. That concludes the end of that 2-year existence of the West Madison racetrack. So we move forward to 1954 or 5, and another group of Arch City businessmen got together and said, let's build a purpose-built dirt oval racetrack for cars, and we aren't going to do 2 and 3 a year, we're going to do them every week. So they built it down in an IXL neighborhood south of Arch City. Next slide. From the south end of the Arkansas River Bridge on South Summit, the track is located another 3/4 mile south and a little less than a half mile west. Here's a 1956 aerial photo. It's another eye chart, but the red arrow is pointing to the 3/8 mile 77 Speedway. Next slide. This slide is a superimposed, marked up current satellite photo that shows you where it was relative to the new highway. The track owners, when it first opened, were Ted and Joyce Allen, who owned Allen Electric in Arch City, Alan Carter, who owned Carter Auto Parts, and Elmer Wharton, another AC resident and racing enthusiast. Like I said, they intended this would run stock car races every week during the season, which ran about from April to October. Next slide. The first race was held on Easter Sunday, April 10, 1955, with 50 or 60 cars from all over Kansas and Oklahoma. And it was jalopy-style stock car racing, similar to the 50s races that were held at the Winfield Fairgrounds. They initially started running them on Sunday afternoons, but at some point they switched to Saturday nights. There were some ownership changes over the years. At one point, Gene Bullard, who had actually, I think, built the track under contract, became one of the partners. And not too far into the venture, 3 years or so, Paul Boyer actually leased the track from the owners, and he would in turn later sublease it to some people from Wichita originally, and I think the last sublessee was from Hutchinson. Next slide. Here's Bill Curlish from Arch City with a very typical jalopy stock car, 32 Ford sedan with a V8. The other racers that I remember as favorites during my own attendance there with my parents and younger brother are Jim Mueller and Harold Lee. But I personally rooted for a guy by the name of Dick Walker, who at some point was running a 32 Plymouth Coupe, because after all, our dad was a Plymouth guy, and we rode in a 49 Plymouth to get to the races. So what else would you root for? And if I remember right, it was the only Plymouth entered in the field typically. In any case, it was in operation for a total of 6 seasons. The final race was run there on Arklala weekend in 1960. Like the other 2 Arch City tracks, there's no evidence that it was ever there today. Even if you look at a satellite view of those locations, they're gone. Next slide. Yes, that's a winky, because we're going to go to Western Cowley County. So far, we're actually going to end up in Sumner County, and I apologize, but that's just the way it works. We're going to talk about the Strother Auxiliary Airfield, 6 miles west of Arch City on 166. Next slide. This is a traveler clipping. Talks about there was a good turnout in 1956, the July 4th celebration at Strother Field, the main Strother Field between the cities, who of course owned the facility. Included in that celebration for the first time in the county that we know of was the first organized, sanctioned quarter-mile drag races. And apparently it was a crowd favorite because the same scene was reported in 57 on the 4th of July where they did the same setup. I believe the city of Arkansas City or the JC or the Chamber of Commerce or some organization was actually behind this. But there's an undercurrent here, and we'll talk about that next. Next slide. The undercurrent involves this facility, which was an adjunct to the main Strother Airport and was also jointly owned by the cities of York City and Winfield. It is what was known to the Army Air Corps as Strother Auxiliary number 5, which was one of 4 landing facilities that were under the control of the main Strother Field Air Base command structure. It is, as I mentioned, 6 miles west of Ark City, 4 miles south of Utah, just into Sumner County. There's 2 4,000-foot runways, and they're connected by a half-mile taxiway that forms a triangle of concrete that you can see in this aerial view. During the active period for this facility during World War II, it was a very, very busy place. It actually had a control tower, fire station with a couple of fire trucks, and a couple of other outbuildings for maintenance. Of course, for the enthusiasts that represented the budding sport of drag racing, it wasn't an old airport, it was a drag strip. Next slide. As early as 55, there was a press that went to the city commissioners that said, it was from the South Central Timing Association in Wichita, requested the use of that facility to run drag races, and they were turned down. But a few months later, next slide, where we at, Jane?
Oh, approximately 10 months.
Okay. Several months later in Ark City, the Gear Grinders Custom Club went before the city commission with a similar request. We want to use it for drags. And they were told in so many words, maybe. About a month later, next slide, they were told, you can use that drag strip, but we got one little caveat. You've got to furnish the liability insurance because we're not going to cover that. Needless to say, that was dead on arrival because there was no way a couple of loose-knit car clubs were going to be able to afford the necessary liability insurance. So the once per year city-sponsored drag races at Main Strother were certainly not enough to satisfy these racers, and they had no permission to use the auxiliary. So I guess the inevitable happened. Illegal, unsanctioned, unsponsored drag races began happening at good old Strother Auxiliary number 5, which by this time was better known as simply the West Auxiliary. It seems that the first organized, and I use that in quotes, outlaw races began on Wednesday nights, probably starting in about 1956 or 1957. In Arctic, the Gear Grinders Club evaporated to be replaced by another car club that was very race-oriented. These outlaw meets would run for 2 and 3 hours under cover of darkness on Wednesday night, or maybe a whole lot less if law enforcement showed up. Because, of course, they were trespassing, and local farmers didn't like the noise, so somebody would ring up the sheriff's department or the Ark City Police or someone and say, run these guys out of here. And that's what would happen occasionally. Next slide. It went on for several years like that, and at one point they even changed the races to Sunday afternoon, hoping that that would put them in better graces, but it didn't really. And this slide is up here a little prematurely. I think I got it out of order. But in any case, it does show that The outlaw races from 55 to 63 were held on the northwest, southeast runway, but the organized legal drag races to this day were run on the north-south runway. In 1964, Wichita men successfully leased those runways for the use of drag racing in an official, sanctioned manner. It had an on and off against history since '64, but in fact, at one point, even the Arkansas City JCs took the track over. In any case, in 2005, the cities auctioned off the entire section, including the then leased drag strip facility. And for a period, the new landowner, continued the existing lease, but about 2011, that relationship failed and the landowner canceled the lease. So finally, in 2017, a family with a drag racing background bought 65 acres to include both 4,000-foot lakes of concrete, plus an entryway, and it's been operating successfully ever since. That pretty much wraps up our somewhat abbreviated automobile racing in Cowley County history.
Thank you, Chair. Gary. Let's take a break now for 15 minutes, opportunity to get drinks, cookies, check out the extra information over here. Presenters have. Check back with the Arts and Humanities people. They've got some things. And then everything over to check out the museum things. 15 minutes, we'll be back and conclude today's program. Everybody got coffee or water or cookie? And just have to remind you that we are having to pay for some of this. So any contributions would certainly be appreciated to help us fund this part of it. Our next presenter has a very interesting way he even became aware of the topic that he's going to talk about, and I know he'll explain that. But in talking about an individual very well known in the Osage Indian culture, also very well known as an Arkansas City business person, but a person that virtually none of us had ever heard about until just in very recent times. With that, call for Tim Durham. There he is. Tim, come forward and that's all about.
Well, how many of you like history?
Oh, what
Oh, I just want to make sure I was in the right place. How many of you like stories about hidden treasure? Still in the right place. Imagine that you buy a house, this big, old, beautiful home that needs a bunch of restoration, and some people are saying, why are you crazy? You want to buy a house like this? And I lived there for a while, and I'm doing some restoration, and imagine you're doing this. And the guys upstairs in the attic that are fixing the air conditioning say, I want you to come and look at something. Wouldn't you be interested? What is it up there? And you get up there and you find this box. I got the box over there. It's a little pink wooden box. We're not sure who left it. Maybe a woman, maybe she painted pink. I don't know. Old kind of fruit box sitting there. Full of abstracts, receipts, letters, pictures, everything about the original owner and builder's life. Imagine how you feel when you start looking through that. Well, that's what happened to me. I found that box, and it's the gift that keeps giving, because I still haven't even read all those letters and looked at all those receipts. It's a ton of stuff. It's 2 big archive notebooks about this big. So, I'm excited to tell you about it, and about the guy that I didn't even know at all, but I can say that I probably know more about him than my in-laws, my neighbors. I know I have all kinds of correspondence from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he is an Osage Indian who was not the chief, but right below the chief. Right below the chief, he was a councilman, and his name was Anthony Carlton. First, I would like to thank my wife, because she put together this PowerPoint. And to be honest with you, without her tenacious sort of research, there's a lot of the stuff we wouldn't have found. Because you have to really, as you historians know, you have to really dig. And you find a string, you pull on it, and something else, and something else. There's so many things about this. But we're always entertained by fiction, and fiction's great, and historical fiction's great. But this, of course, really did happen. And I got the goods on it. I mean, it's right over there, that actual document. You guys may or may not know, but the Osage Indians had a special place in American history. The Osage was a tribe that had a special sort of treaty where they got to keep the mineral rights, really anything in the ground, as part of their treaty. And so because of that, when they discovered oil on the land, the Osage became the richest indigenous tribe in the world. They literally had more money than they knew what to do with. And it really helped them in many ways, but it also destroyed their culture in many ways. And when Sandy and I were down in Pawhuska researching this, we stayed at a bed and breakfast, and the guy who ran the bed and breakfast, his name was Redcorn, and we were talking about the stories that the Osage would buy a car and drive it around till it ran out of gas, and then just go buy another one. And I was talking, I go, is that really true? And he goes, oh yeah, it's true. He goes, my granddad has like 11 cars. So yes, it's true. They received $15,000 each, and you went on the tribal growth, those after 1906. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of money for a year, but that's the equivalent of about $500,000 today. And so it's kind of amazing. Give us the next slide, please. I do have a slideshow here about that. That's the picture of the house, and that's the picture of Anthony Carlton. That's where I've been living for about almost 25 years, and it's quite a place. It's as you can see, it's stucco with Spanish influence, tile roof, 2 fireplaces. I mean, it's got the original sconces and chandeliers. It's quite a place, and it's pretty big. And it requires quite a little bit of tender loving care to keep it in good shape. You know how old the houses are. So the Osages were unique. Most of them were unprepared to deal with this influx of money, if you can imagine. And a lot of them were swindled, and later on we'll talk about the Reign of Terror, where a lot of them were killed, and their money was basically stolen from them. A lot of them would and they really liked these arts and crafts homes, but a lot of them would build a home like this, but they still lived most of the time in the backyard in a teepee. We found out from looking through our information that they had what they called fancy dancing in the backyard. I didn't know what fancy dancing was. I had to research it. But that's the Indian dancing, kind of similar to a powwow. Now, powwow is more of a kind of a political thing, but they would have fancy dancing in the backyard of the house I'm living in. So Anthony Carlton, he was a councilman right below the chief. And give me the next slide, please. Here's some of the information I found, just so you'll have a look at it. A lot of the actual documents are archived over there. Okay, give me the next slide, please. There he is. That's a picture of the guy. Anthony was, his mother's father was actually French. Choteau was the name. But he was born in Indian Territory in the Fairfax area, and he had 3 children. His first wife passed away, and then he married Ada, was his second wife, and Ada, he actually built this house for her. He met Ada in Fairfax as she worked at the mercantile there, and not Fairfax, Pawhuska. And so he would travel to Ark City. I still don't really know exactly why he relocated to Ark City. I need to maybe read some more letters. But the thing you need to know about Anthony was that he was an unusual character, that he was at home with the prominent culture, white people, but he was also at home with his people, the Osage people. He was a businessman. He was very intelligent and well thought of and very prominent in the culture. He discovered oil in the Burbank Field. Now, the Burbank Field, I don't know how familiar you are with Oklahoma, but it's a little town called Burbank, just a few miles east of Ponca. And that is where, next slide, please. What does this slide say? Yeah, that's the one. He found oil there, and this was the highest yielding oil well in the world at one time. Now, the long story, or the short story, is that he ended up selling this to a gentleman named Marlin, which became Marlin Oil, became, who knows, Conoco. It's oil right there. Now, the town is still there. It has about 200 people in it now. At one time, it had over 3,000 people. The bank is still there, and it's got bulletproof glass. So the glass is still there. The bulletproof glass. This was rough frontier, roughnecks, and the bank was robbed like about 4 times. So it was a different sort of world with people having this sort of influx of money. Okay. After becoming a member of the tribal council, Anthony Carlton traveled to Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. I can't read that. I mean, what is this one?
This is Indian oil land auctioneer makes Osage world's richest people.
Okay, this is just more of what I was talking about. Next slide, please. That's Burbank. It's just a little town, but it's still there. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is what I was talking about. They talk about in the movie, this Killers of the Flower Moon, that they kept going to Washington. Why were the Osage going to Washington? 2 reasons. One reason was they actually had too much money. It was destroying their culture. They were getting killed and swindled, and they didn't know what to do with this money. They didn't even know. And then the government said, well, you have to have a sponsor. You have to have somebody kind of pay you to take care of it. And that they have used that as well. So they go to Washington to try to get help. They also go to Washington for another reason, and that is that they were dropping like flies. I didn't know really a lot about this until I studied it. I grew up in Enid, Oklahoma, and by state law, you have to have what they call Oklahoma history. They don't really tell you really what happened. I mean, all this stuff that I didn't know anything about. It's been sort of forgotten about the reign of terror and what actually happened. But Anthony went. Now, Anthony is not particularly shown in the movie. He doesn't have a part, but he was certainly there, and he knew all these people involved. So, I failed to mention earlier that they had all kind of events and things at the house. Ada was very, very, next slide please. Ada was very, very busy in the community raising money for the YMCA, and this was during World War I. This is Anthony's daughters. He actually had 3 daughters. They had private French lessons, they had harp lessons, and they went to private schools. And I even have the receipts of the schools where they went to, and all the letters they wrote when they wrote home. One letter was funny. We were just looking at it the other day, looking through this stuff. It's like I said, the gift that keeps on giving. And the daughters were saying to their dad in a letter, "When are you going to make some more wine?" And Anthony writes back saying, "I've been too busy." And so Ethel writes back and says, "Well, let me know when you get around to it. P.S. Don't get caught." During those days, you had to make your own wine, and you didn't want to get caught. Okay, next slide, please. That's just an old picture of the house. I don't know what color. Right now, it's kind of a cream color, but I don't know what that is, but you can see. I mean, it's a big place. Unfortunately, it has a lot of windows to wash. And Sandy, doesn't particularly want to do all of them.
96.
Yes. She's done them all at least once in the last few years. Next slide, please. We have a carriage house in the back, an actual carriage house where they kept the horses, and also next to where the horses were, there was a little tiny apartment that the chauffeur lived in. So he was right there. He was up with the horses. They also have a side entrance that's a servant's entrance. You come in the side, and it's kind of a narrow hallway, and you go right into the kitchen. And they had white servants, interestingly. Next slide, please. Okay, there were lots and lots of little articles in the newspaper. Lots of articles. Every time they'd buy a new car, we were talking about cars, they had like a coal roadster, and they'd put it in the paper. Every time they did something, even when they went out of town, or they put that stuff in the paper, the personal stuff that people talked about. I'll talk a little bit more about the reign of terror. Give me the next slide, please. Get these in order. Okay, we talked about some of the home furnishings. I got the receipts on the stuff they bought. I mean, it really is something if you look at the stuff. Next one, please. They went on cruises all over the world. I mean, wouldn't you, if you had money that you didn't know what to do with, you think, well, let's just go on a cruise. Let's buy a new car. They did all that stuff. Next one, please. They owned racehorses. Why not? Next one, please. Oh, I talked about the cars. They had expensive cars, and they drove them around. There was an article in the paper about when someone ran into the new car. It was just a little paragraph because people wanted to know what Anthony Carlton was doing that day. He was pretty well known around that. Next one, please. Okay, back to what they call the reign of terror. I didn't know anything about this. Most of you all probably didn't either because it's kind of a hidden part of our history. And that is the Osage people started dying. They started dropping like flies, and they couldn't figure out why. And of course, if you've seen the movie Killer in the Flower Moon, You know what happened? People that were friends and even husbands and so of the Osage were killing them. They were poisoning them. They would shoot them. They would blow up their house. I mean, it's very, very tragic. Why were they doing that? Because they get into the family, they get the head rights, now they had the money. And the police were in on it, and the civic leaders were in on it. But the FBI did crack the case. It was their first big case. The FBI had just gotten started. It was called the Bureau of Investigation, and later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When Sandy and I were reading about this, we literally said, someone should write a book about it. Somebody should make a movie about this. Well, they wrote a book and they made a movie. It's called Killer of the Flower Moon. It's a very, very interesting show. It's kind of long and there's a lot going on because real life is kind of messy. But it's, how many of you have seen that movie? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. That's what all this is about. And it's a timely thing because it's just fascinating. It's tragic. But it's good to know that have the truth come out. The truth come out to know, about our history. Because history is really important. It's tragic, but there's something healing about there. And there's something you have to, you have to recognize the truth before you do anything with it. So the reign of terror. Now, okay, next one, please. Okay, that's a picture, I believe, of Ada. Or no, is that Amy?
No, that's Ada.
Is that Ada? Okay, Ada.
I think they skipped some.
Okay. Go back, please, just make sure. Okay, yeah, this is what I want to talk about. Okay, the story is that Anthony and Ada hear about a woman that's having a revival in Wichita. Her name is Amy Semple McPherson. Some of you might know her, some of you may have never heard of her. She was the most famous woman probably in the world at the time. She was the first woman to have a radio license and a radio program. She traveled around, and she was very, very controversial, eccentric, powerful personality. She was an evangelist. And she would travel around and just start preaching on the street corner, and then they would go that night to the opera house, and there would be hundreds of people there. So this woman was kind of like dynamite. She was a spiritual dynamite. They're curious, so they want to go. Now you got to remember, they're living this highfalutin lifestyle where they're drinking and gambling and buying stuff and just kind of living the life with all this extra money. They decide they're going to take a friend of theirs. And this guy's name was Joe Moore. He was the sports writer for The Traveler. And a bunch of Osage friends of theirs. They go up to Wichita to see Amy Semple McPherson. And Joe happened to be handicapped. And he walked with a crutch and kind of had a humpback. And he had trouble getting around. He was a very talented writer. He goes up there, listens to them preach, and goes forward and gets healed. He gets healed of his infirmity. And he comes back and tells his testimony, and it's on the front page of The Traveler. And he says, I'm just telling you what happened. And so they're very excited about this. And they come back and tell everybody in our city, and they decide, we're going to bring her to our city. Let's bring this woman to our city. So she says, well, I'll come, but I want the whole town to invite me. I want your support. So they go to the Ministerial Alliance. They get the Ministerial Alliance, the Chamber of Commerce, the YMCA, and a whole bunch of other stuff. They send her a telegram, which I have, and invite her to Ark City. She comes. Amy Semple McPherson comes to Ark City, to the rotunda at Wilson Park. There's 5,000 people there. 5,000 people. And the story that I got from The Traveler is, first off, it's raining, cats and dogs, and she comes out and raises her hands and asks God to stay the rain or stop the rain for just a few minutes so the people don't have to stand in the rain, and it stopped. Which really got everyone's attention. So she gets to preaching and stuff, and then when she's done, there's kind of a small pile of wheelchairs and crutches and canes and stuff sitting up there on stage. And then she goes and stays that night at Anthony's house. Now, this was a big deal for this area of our city. Lots of churches got started, and lots of churches got built around this time. Some of them are mostly still around. But it was kind of a revival because people were yearning for something personal and not religious. And this particular form of Christianity was very emotional and powerful. It was about having a direct relationship with God and an experience rather than just religious sort of things. And that actually happened. So we think that's kind of amazing that that experience, there were 5,000 people at Wilson Park to see anybody. And after that, yes? Question?
Remember that Anthony carried Joe's crutches.
That's right, that's what they were. Anthony carried Joe's crutches behind him after he got healed. Okay. Now, Ada comes back and they start having kind of Bible studies and stuff in their house. And Ada becomes a pastor of the Foursquare Church. And there's a Foursquare Church in our city still on S Street. And it becomes a pastor and starts the church in our city, which is still there, and influences a lot of other churches. There's articles in there where they're having prayer services at the Presbyterian Church and healing and all this stuff going on, and people putting their testimonies in the paper, real personal testimonies about their spiritual life. Ada becomes a pastor, starts a church in our city, and she's a busy bee. She's going around, she's doing all this stuff. And I'll tell you something else. Pardon me?
Next slide.
Okay, next slide. I'll get it on my slide. Next slide, please. This is something else. My wife is also a Foursquare pastor. She was ordained by the Foursquare.
Oh, wow.
What do you think about that? Okay, this is a picture. They had pageants and things, and of course, a lot of the stuff they did publicly. And something they learned from Emcee McPherson was they did pageants. They did very, like plays and things like that in churches. It was a different way to learn about that. So, I mentioned that Carlton's wanted to share their new faith with everyone. And so that's why that started. And Amy several McPherson came to town. And their lives sort of changed after that. That I think their focus, from what I can glean, was less on just buying stuff and more on what they thought was more important, which was their spiritual life and how their life affects other people. Okay, thank you. Okay, go to that next one, please. I'm sure where we're at. This is actually Anthony's tombstone. He's at Riversdale Cemetery, Riverview Cemetery, next to Ada in our city. So I talked a little bit about the citywide revival because of all these things happening. Now, Anthony died on July 20th, 1927, and almost every business and civic leader in the area attended the funeral. I have all the little cards that come, with the floral arrangements of all these people that were bankers and lawyers and pastors and civic leaders. So here's what they say about Anthony Carlton. Anthony Carlton, one of the city's best-known residents, a counselor and a prominent member of the Osage tribe, died yesterday. Death found him. The rugged character that he was in the midst of activity. He was playing golf, getting the year loved. After a vigorous life, he leaves the record for any man, and for Anthony Carlton, of 60 years of intimate association with the affairs of his people, the Osage Indians. When he was a boy and a young man, the future of the tribe did not look promising. The Osages had been shunted from the broad farmlands of southern Kansas to the rocky hills of northern Oklahoma. It looked as if the tribe would suffer. Then came the magic of oil, and Anthony Carlton was one of the wise heads who urged conservation of the tribal resources. He spent the remainder of his life working for his people. He was a quiet man with a dignified manner and commanded respect. Our Kansas City will miss Anthony Carlton. Sturdy characters are always missed, yet they leave behind them an imperishable record that is their finest record. It's easy to infer that Anthony Carlton learned a great deal about what was important in life, because he had it all, but he spent it all, and he lost the rest of it in time with what happened, because the oil usually doesn't last forever. Or you can, even if you have that kind of money, you can spend it, and he certainly did. But it's certain that he not only had meaning in his life because the hard work he did with the Osages, but this newfound faith he had as well, and his untimely death probably made it a little less tragic for Ada, because she certainly believed that her husband was at true peace with God. So this story has a lot in it. I tried to keep it short. I could talk about this a long time, but I'm about done here. You can certainly contact me if you want to see that stuff more intimately. People that like history are fascinated by that. I certainly am. I had no idea that any of this existed, or the house that I lived in. By the way, as a commercial, Sandy and I are probably going to be moving soon. So, we're going to have a really nice big old house to sell. If anyone's here crazy enough to buy one of those. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I think probably some folks may have questions, so if Jim can come back up, Gary, Joann, come up. Questions for any of the presenters while they're coming. I have a few things mentioned. If you haven't signed in, please be sure to do so. If you've got suggestions for any future topics for this, well, please make a note of those. We're always looking for new topics to do. Certainly appreciate it. And while they're coming on up, remind we've got $800 to cover here, so any donations would be muchly appreciated. And any questions for anybody, please ask.
Did he have a good bodyguard? Did Anthony have a good bodyguard? Not that I have here.
Not that I can tell you anything about. It's certain. Usually, people in that stratus of society had people that kind of cared for him and walked around. He was a very independent person, but I don't really know. But I could probably find out if I keep reading his letters. Good question.
Tim, I just want to mention, we became very, I don't know how it all evolved, very close to he and his wife. And he has told us so many stories. One thing I think is really interesting is that there were 4 Osage chiefs in Ark City when he was there. 4 of them. And there were gypsies. It was really a different place.
That's true. She's talking. I didn't mention this, but one of the things about Amy Semple McPherson's brand of faith was she welcomed the gypsies. We had a lot of gypsies that lived in our city. She would welcome them to the church, and also the interracial worship with black people, blacks and whites worshiping together. Was some of these newspaper articles was like, and blacks and whites are worshiping together. What's the world coming to? It was really, really controversial at one time, and somebody had to kind of break that, you know. And it was amazing that she did.
Another thing, I've always lived in Winfield. The people in Ark City knew about the killing of the Flower Moon situation, always. But they kept it quiet, they never talked about it. The people in Winfield had no idea that any of that ever went on, but we had Osage all over Winfield and teepees when it was built. And if you get a chance to go to their presentations, don't miss it. He was so sweet. He and his wife Sandy had my whole club down, and we got to tour the house, and he gave us the whole presentation, and a lot of them are here today. And it is amazing. And then we went to the thing in 2022 in the park that was the reenactment of all of that. They're amazing.
We did reenact that 100, called it the 100-year blessing, where we reenacted Amy sitting on the bridge coming to town, and we had somebody to play her, and Sandy and I played Anthony and Ada Carlton, and we were all, it's costumed and everything. It was really great.
Do you think they lived in Ark City? Because I'm not sure, but was there killing going on in Ark City, or was that mostly happening in Oklahoma? Did some people move from there to try to protect themselves?
We think so, because they were kind of dropping like flies. I mean, it was really tragic. They don't really know how many people were directly killed, but it could easily be in the hundreds, 200.
In the movie, they seem to talk about one family, but this happened through, I mean, the movie doesn't tell the whole story, right?
Well, it does a good job of this very complicated subject, but, and I think it's historically accurate, but it doesn't tell everything. No, even though it's about 3 hours long, that's why this is so much.
But there were other families that experienced it.
And they didn't really go into the Osage background.
You said his mother was French. Did he have
In the
a
book,
Native
it was all
American
about
name?
all of the Osage people.
Say again.
Did he have an American
You said his mother was French. Did he have a Native American name?
No, he did not. He did not. The name happens. He was born on, Oklahoma territory or Indian territory near Fairfax. But his name is actually Anthony Carlton. His nickname was Gabe. But he didn't have. But most of his contemporaries had names like Strike Axe, Chief Lookout, another chief there. Chief. Yeah, Chief Bacon Ryan, I think is an interesting name.
Kind of follow that place, but did he have a head right through his marriage to this woman who was at Osage?
Did he have a head right? Because he was Osage, mostly Osage, and he was born on the Indian territory. But his first wife did have head rights. Even though she didn't look very Osage, she was quite Anglo looking. And Ada, his second wife, had some head rights as well. But see, they would get paid, but also their kids would get paid as well. So I mean, it was an enormous amount of money.
My cousin's father and grandmother ran the grocery store. And so I was wanting to hear she wants to hear some more about the activities at the grocery store. Her grandmother ran it, and her father pitched in again while he was farming. So she couldn't make it, so she really wants to know more about the activities at the grocery store.
There's a story in the book that Kenny shared with me about domino games. There were domino games, Marlene Greer told me, a couple days a week. in the grocery store in the evenings. And kind of the fun part of that was they were sliding the dump. They would stand, as I understand, next to a display case. And they played dominoes for so many years, and so many dominoes had been moved around that you could no longer see through the glass on the top of the case. And so at some point, the oil company, I believe, built a building near the center of the camp, near the basketball court, for the domino games to get switched to another place. And this story about that is in the book. So, thank you. Thank you for your question and comments.
Gary, share with us what you had and why you've got racing things over here.
Yeah, that's, as Bill said, that's my stuff. Yesterday afternoon, we were setting this up. I looked over there and I see Anthony's stuff on his table, and I see Joann's stuff on her table, and I'm thinking, Gary, I think you missed something here. So last night, my wife and I gathered up some of my stuff. And it gives a little credibility to my penchant for auto racing and why I took on this subject this afternoon or this morning, because I am a racer, or was at least. So that's one of my old riding suits and gloves and helmet and some trophies. And Tim's talked about a lot of money. That's a lot of money. No, I enjoyed sports car racing for several years, over a couple of decades or more, in and out, but I sincerely enjoyed it, and I don't think I'll be going back to that money pit.
Joann, that wooden schoolhouse with Rainbow Bend, that looks an awful lot like the one at Tanny Hill. Do you have any idea if that was me?
Well, I mentioned that to Gary, and he said he believed that there was kind of a standard design for schoolhouses, and so in the last week or so, as I have gone down the road near Tanny Hill School, which is now the Beaver Township Hall, there's a portion of that that looks identical to that first Rainbow Bend school, and so now I'm speculating that they perhaps added probably the cloakroom at the old Tanny Hill Grade School was part of the original building, and then they probably added possibly they added the part just inside the front door where the entrance to the basement is and the restrooms. But where is Mary Ellen Woods still here? Do you remember anything about that, Mary Ellen? About Tanny Hill? Did they add the restrooms after they opened the building in that location?
We didn't have any more restrooms at the old location.
Okay. Because that was the third location for Tanny Hill, and I think the south room at Tanny Hill was put over the basement, where the building, I believe, that was from the second location was the north, what we call the north room at Tanny Hill. But that's a good point, Marvin. They looked identical.
Any other questions for any of the presenters? If not, we certainly thank you all for coming today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next January.
You need to see it.
space. I got 46 windows. So I know what you mean.